Hello, time for another vlog. Um, but this one is going to be about theories about the origin of the universe, rather than general stuff. Um, it's a sciencey type blog, but more philosophy, I think, rather than science. Obviously, science comes into it. I want to look at the four basic theories that we have for the origin of the universe, or the four basic ideas about it, and pretty much the difficulties they present, because it turns out that perhaps the most unlikely one is the only one that actually works in terms of logic. Okay, so I'll start with the traditional one. The traditional theory that we've had about the origin of the universe throughout a long time of our history anyway, is that it was created by God or gods or something transcendent. The reason for the theory, okay, there are historical reasons. People believed in that sort of thing, and from a logical perspective, it does actually work. So you've got to think about that, and there are strange events that happen in the world, so there is something going on. But from a point of view of the origin of the universe, the reason it works as a theory is that the universe consists of space and time and matter and energy, and there's no obvious place where that could have come from. Given that we know from observation, or we think we know from observation, that the universe had a beginning about 14 billion years ago, give or take. The date changes a bit depending on more recent observations and calculations, but something like that. The thing is, where would it come from? Because before the universe there would be no space and time, or matter or energy. So why is there something rather than nothing? Obviously, if there was nothing, we wouldn't be here to wonder about it, but that doesn't solve the or answer the question. So people say, and this indicates, that perhaps it was created by something which is transcendent, that is, something which is not subject to space, time, matter or energy. Something beyond that. Similarly with spatial dimensions, we have about maybe 10 spatial dimensions, and a dimension of time or something like that, or 9 space and 1 time or something to that effect, or 21 depending on the calculations you're making or your theory. 3-dimensional space are visible, 1 of time is experienced. So whatever it is would probably not be subject to those either. You see, the thing is, the obvious question is, if a god created the universe, then what created the god? That's the next objection, right? But that is kind of assuming that God is subject to space and time and matter and energy and all that. Whereas the definition we have of God is something that transcends that, so is not subject to that, to those constraints. Because obviously if God was subject to time, then the same issues with the beginning of the universe would apply to God. And so the theory would fall on that basis. But if there is something truly transcendent outside the universe, beyond it at least, then logically that does stand. The difficulty with it is, of course, that we can't imagine such a thing. We can name it in words, but when people imagine God, they imagine a human-type critter usually, existing in space and time somewhere, in heaven or wherever. And that's not... That's something which maybe we would experience when we die and we go there. If we do, then we'll experience something like that, presumably, unless we become transcendent as well. Because we certainly experience this world as a sequence of time events and three-dimensional. We know that it may not really be like that, because physics is really telling us about how what we experience works. It doesn't really tell us what it is that we're experiencing. What is this thing? But that's another video. In terms of logic, the God theory does work, provided you accept that the possibility of something which is absolutely transcendent. If you don't accept that possibility, then you have to move on to the other theories, which also have problems. First one is that the universe was created by nothing. So quite a few physicists kind of will say that when you listen to them. There was nothing and then there was the universe, bang, or it appeared. But there's no explanation there. Now you have books like Lawrence Krauss's A Universe from Nothing. And Stephen Hawking also wrote about a universe coming from not quite nothing, because both of them actually require something for there to be a universe. So in Lawrence Krauss's case, he talks about how the laws or how quantum mechanics, in effect, created the universe. It made the universe necessary. This doesn't work because the quantum mechanics is not nothing. And furthermore, it relies on the presence of matter, energy, space, time and dimensions for there to be any quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is the rules of behaviour of those things. Similarly with Stephen Hawking's idea that gravity made the universe necessary and sprang into existence, there was no gravity when there was nothing, because gravity operates on matter. There wasn't any. There would be no law of gravity. Furthermore, just to clear up a confusion, the laws of nature don't do anything. They don't make anything happen. The laws of nature are just descriptions of what usually happens. So the law of gravity doesn't make things fall to Earth. Things fall to Earth, and we describe it with the law of gravity. So just to be clear, so if there were no things, there would be no law of gravity, and there would be no gravity. Same with quantum mechanics. And all the other laws of physics. They're just descriptions. We don't really know what's behind them. We don't know really what matter is or energy. Energy is defined as the ability to do work. How that gets transmitted around by photons and stuff. We have pictures of particles exchanging subparticles and taking the properties with them, but they're just numbers. We have no clue what anything physical actually is. And we probably don't have a way to describe it in language anyway. But in any case, for the universe to spring from nothing, all the proposals require something. Because logically nothing comes from nothing, because by definition nothing is nothing. Literally nothing, nothing at all. No properties. No time, no existence. Nothing. So the idea that the universe could have sprung literally from nothing doesn't make any logical sense. It would appear to be impossible. Next theory. This is the idea that the universe was created by something physical. So we're talking about things like eternal inflation, Alan Guth's theory, that we're like a bubble universe in like a metaverse which is expanding beyond us and creating billions and billions or trillions of other universes, and ours happens to have laws which work for life because it's chance and it's one of a gazillion of other universes. Incidentally, this expansion has to be happening at an enormous rate. I think it's doubling in size something like every Planck time, 10 to the minus 33 of a second or so. So it doubles in size by 2 to the power of 33 every second, which is a massive number. And this is why none of these bubble universes could collide with each other, because they're being spread apart way too fast. That's fine, but then Guth himself, along with Borde and Vilenkin, came up with the BVG theorem. Borde, Guth and Vilenkin, which appears to show that any expanding universe type system can be wound back. They say it's geodesically incomplete. It comes back to a beginning. If you undo the expansion, wind it backwards, you come back to a beginning. Same as with our Big Bang. When we observe that the universe appears to be expanding, it could be an illusion, in which case some other theory will apply. Maybe the next one I come to. But if it is expanding, then it's expanding from something. And the logical place is a singularity or a 0 point, whatever the laws of physics allow. And the same goes for this multiverse creating eternal inflation. It isn't eternal. It has a beginning. There are other issues with the that theory as well, in that one of the purposes of the eternal inflation theory was to explain the fact that this universe is incredibly well fine-tuned for life, or to explain it away. Because if we take Penrose's number, which is 10 to the 10 to the 120, I think, or close to, those are the odds, based purely on thermodynamics, I think, of this universe being fine-tuned as much as it was. Because the second law of thermodynamics says that entropy, or disorder if you like, is always increasing overall throughout the system. Life forms like us create order temporarily, but we do it by burning fuel, which generates heat, which effectively is disorder. So the net balance is that disorder increases throughout time. Stars burn up and wind down and explode and, create a mess generally, and everything will eventually even out so that there's just absolutely random heat and nothing else anywhere, basically. That's the idea. But the thing is that this universe started with extremely low entropy, multiple decimal places. And Roger Penrose calculated the odds as 10 to the 10 to the 120. You can probably look up his calculation on Google or somewhere if you want to see the details. Now that number, those odds, are literally astronomically small. Now let's look at 10 to the 120 is, if we take 10 to the 12 to be a trillion, okay, then 10 to the 120 is 1 in a trillion, 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 trillion. But that's not the odds. It's 10 to the 10 to the trillion, 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 trillion. So that is a 1 followed by a trillion, 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 trillion zeros. That's more zeros than there are subnuclear particles in the entire known universe. In fact, it's more particles than there are in a trillion, 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 trillion universes like ours, in fact. So the odds of this kind of fine-tuning is thought to be very small. There's lots of other fine-tunings on top of that as well. The properties of carbon and the strength of the various forces of nature. They could be more or less anything in theory, and yet they're matched. And some of them have to be not only within range, they have to also be proportionately correct with respect to other forces. So several of the forces need to be fine-tuned with respect to each other, as well as being right for making our life possible. So the idea of the eternal inflation was to come up with a theory that might allow for this fine-tuning. And the idea was, if there are trillions and trillions of universes, then finding one fine-tuned wouldn't be so surprising. Fine, but studies on maths, basically logic, indicate that actually to be able to create a universe with our kinds of laws, that meta-universe would have to be even more fine-tuned than this one is. So the theory didn't work. Also, it's not eternal, it has a beginning. Maybe someone could come up with some system that doesn't have a beginning, and then we have theory number 4. This is the idea that the universe has always existed in some shape or form, and therefore doesn't need to have a beginning explained because there wasn't one. This is a bit hard to grasp, because we're used to things having beginnings and explanations. But this one is a way to get around it by saying, no, we don't need an explanation, it's always been here. First of all, this does seem to contradict the laws of thermodynamics, because as I say, it's clear that this universe had extraordinarily low entropy 14 billion years ago. Furthermore, if it was infinitely old, we would expect it by now to have infinite entropy, or maximum entropy if there's such a thing. And it clearly doesn't. So, first of all, the theory breaches the laws of thermodynamics as we understand them, and they're pretty well established. Another problem with a universe that has existed forever, even if it's just like a cyclic one which big bangs and big crunches repeatedly, is that it is subject to time, and there are issues with infinity and time. Any physical theory which includes infinity is generally considered to be probably wrong, because the physical world doesn't seem to do infinity, and logic doesn't like infinity either. And really, when you get down to it, the very fact that we are here without infinite entropy, still generating entropy, disorder, is a kind of a proof that the universe cannot have been here forever. And you can think about it in another way. Well, think about it like this. How did the present moment get here if there's an infinite period of time before it can happen? Surely, in order for this moment to happen, an infinite number of other moments must have already happened. But let's go back a moment. How did that moment get here? An infinite number before that. Let's go back billions and trillions of years to some moment back then. Before that moment could happen, an infinite number of other moments would have had to happen first. Let's go back another trillion years or whatever. Before that moment could happen, an infinite number of other moments would have had to happen first. So in an infinitely old universe, nothing could ever happen, because every moment is preceded by an infinity of others. Such a universe would have nothing happening at all, which is a bit mind-blowing. But you might say, well, wait a minute, we're here, so maybe this infinite time has happened. I think that suggests a misunderstanding, because an infinite amount of time will never happen. You can't wait forever and get to now, because forever never comes. It's literally forever. And we can't think about it like saying, right, let's jump into this universe at this moment in time, and here we are, and stuff's happening. Because you can't jump into a universe. You're a part of it, or you're God, right? Okay. At least from our perspective. So you can't sit outside the timeline and choose an infinite timeline at that and choose some moment and say, right, that's now. Look, it's happening. Because things which are subject to time have to start from the beginning. And they have to travel along the timeline of the universe to get to whatever moment they're in. But there is no first moment in such a universe. No matter how far back you go, there's an infinity more moments to go back through. There's no first moment, there's no second moment. There's no third moment, there are no moments. Nothing can happen. It's a logical impossibility. The eternal inflation, or just our Big Bang. The eternal inflation is a logical impossibility because it winds up having its own kind of Big Bang, which must have come from what? Our own Big Bang from nothing. Nothing creates nothing. Nobody's thought of something which could exist prior to the universe, which could create a universe, and which doesn't itself need creating. So, weirdly enough, the only one that survives the logical arguments is the idea of something transcendent. Is this a limitation of human understanding? Or is this telling us something about the nature of reality? comments below, please. I'm interested to hear your arguments or disputes on what I've said. Bye for now.